For decades, we've looked up at the stars. But what if something out there has already been waiting for us? In the dawn of a new era, a question lingered in the air. Who will be the first private company in America to send a manned spacecraft to the International Space Station? For decades, the United States has lived by its identity as a nation of explorers, pushing boundaries across land, sea, air, and now space.
It's incredible.
Yet in the modern age, exploration has shifted hands, from governments to the daring innovators of private enterprise. What was once the domain of NASA alone has now become a race among visionaries, engineers, and entrepreneurs who believe that humanity's destiny lies beyond the Earth's atmosphere. This moment is not simply about launching astronauts. It is about reigniting the spirit of a country that had not sent humans to space from its own soil since 2011. Nearly a decade of waiting, of watching Russian Soyuz rockets carry American astronauts into orbit at a staggering cost of billions of dollars, had built up into a single desire: to return proudly to spaceflight independence. But the path to this milestone has been anything but smooth. Since the retirement of the space shuttle, NASA faced a void. The shuttle had been a workhorse, flawed, costly, but symbolic of American dominance in orbit. When it retired, the United States lost its direct capability to send humans to the International Space Station. Instead, astronauts were ferried aboard Russian rockets launched from Kazakhstan, an arrangement that cost the U.S. over $80 million per seat. Dependence on Russia was never intended to last forever. The challenge was clear. America needed its own ride to space again. Several companies stepped into the arena, but two rose above the rest: Boeing, with its Starliner capsule, and SpaceX, with its Dragon spacecraft. Both were funded under NASA's Commercial Crew Program, a bold initiative that flipped the traditional model of space exploration on its head. Instead of the government owning, operating, and controlling every piece of hardware, NASA would become a customer. Private companies would design, build, and operate the spacecraft, competing for contracts while driving innovation forward. It was a radical departure from the old way of doing things. Critics question whether private companies could ever achieve the same level of reliability and safety as NASA, but supporters argue that this approach would bring down costs, speed up innovation, and open the doors to an entirely new space economy.
Incredible.
SpaceX,
energy it's giving off.
Founded in 2002 by Elon Musk, had already proven its ability to shake up the aerospace industry. With reusable rockets and daring visions of colonizing Mars, Musk had positioned his company not just as a contractor, but as a pioneer in humanity's next great adventure. Boeing, on the other hand, carried the weight of history. As a longtime NASA partner, Boeing had decades of experience, resources, and prestige. The competition was fierce. Now, with the world watching, the first crewed launch was just days away. SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft, perched atop a Falcon 9 rocket, stood ready on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, the very same pad that once carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. For Elon Musk and his team, this was more than a mission. It was a culmination of nearly 2 decades of risk, failure, learning, and triumph. If all went well, this would be the first time in nearly a decade that American astronauts would leave Earth aboard an American rocket, launched from American soil. It would also mark the first time in history that a private company had carried humans into orbit, but success was far from guaranteed. The rocket stood tall, towering 23 stories above the ground, its white body gleaming under Florida sun. To the engineers and technicians who had worked tirelessly on every nut, bolt, and line of code, this machine was more than metal. It was a result of sleepless nights, endless simulations, countless failures, and small victories stitched together into something greater than themselves. The Falcon 9 was not just another rocket. It represented a shift in how humanity approached space. Unlike the massive Saturn V that thundered the Apollo astronauts to the moon, Falcon 9 was designed with reusability at its core. In the past, rockets were single-use machines, burned in minutes, discarded forever in oceans or on barren plains. Musk had argued that if airplanes were used only once, no one could afford to fly. The same logic applied to space travel.
Incredible.
Falcon 9 was the first rocket in history to regularly land back on Earth, ready to be refurbished and flown again. Each landing reduced cost. Each reuse brought space travel closer to affordability, and each successful mission silenced skeptics who had once dismissed the idea as science fiction. Yet, the stakes here were different. This time, the payload was not a satellite or a cargo capsule. It was human lives. Two men, veterans of spaceflight, entrusted their futures to the integrity of Falcon 9 and the spacecraft strapped atop it, the Crew Dragon. Dragon itself was sleek, modern, and compact. Its design stood in stark contrast to the Space Shuttle, which had once defined American spaceflight. The shuttle had been a flying laboratory, capable of carrying large payload satellites and modules into orbit. It was enormous, complex, and heavy, a marvel of engineering, but also a machine plagued by risks. Twice, tragedy had struck, the Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, reminders that space was unforgiving. The shuttle was powerful, but had grown old, expensive, and dangerous to operate. By 2011, NASA had retired it, leaving a void that Dragon now sought to fill. Dragon was not a laboratory. It was not a truck for heavy cargo. Instead, it was a capsule, reminiscent of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs of the 1960s and 70s. Small, compact, but cutting-edge in design. Its interior was stripped of the hundreds of switches, knobs, and dials that had once overwhelmed astronauts inside spacecraft. Instead, sleek touchscreens stretched across its dashboard, resembling more a futuristic aircraft than the cramped capsules of the past. Inside, astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley would have the ability to fly Dragon manually, but in truth, the spacecraft was designed to operate on its own. Fully autonomous, it could launch, navigate, dock, and return without human hands touching controls. The suits worn by Behnken and Hurley also symbolize a new era. Gone were the bulky orange flight suits of the shuttle era. In their place, slim, white, one-piece suits designed by SpaceX to be functional yet elegant. Each suit was pressurized, capable of supplying oxygen, and connected directly to the spacecraft through a plug-in system integrated into the seats. Even the helmets were 3D printed. More than safety equipment, these suits were part of the philosophy that space travel should be inspiring, futuristic, and accessible. Musk himself had once said that space exploration should not only work, but look good while doing it. As launch day approached, tension built across the nation. The coronavirus pandemic had shut down much of the world, and for the first time in history, a crewed American launch would take place without crowds of spectators gathering on the beaches near Kennedy Space Center. NASA administrators pleaded with the public to stay home and watch the launch online. The pandemic had forced astronauts and their families into extended quarantines, separating them from the outside world for weeks before the mission. Space travel had always carried risks, but now those risks included not only the dangers of launch and re-entry, but also the threat of a virus invisible to the eye. Still, the symbolism of this mission was impossible to ignore. For the United States, it was more than a technological milestone. It was a matter of pride, independence, and resilience. To launch astronauts from American soil again meant breaking free from reliance on Russia, reclaiming a role as a leader in human spaceflight. And for SpaceX, it was proof that a private company, once dismissed as reckless and inexperienced, could rise to meet the challenges that even nations struggle with. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley were not ordinary astronauts. Both had flown on the space shuttle. Both were test pilots with thousands of flight hours, and both understood the magnitude of what they were about to do. Hurley, in particular, carried a unique legacy. In 2011, he had flown on the final shuttle mission, STS-135, and watched as the shuttle program came to its close. He had left behind a small American flag on the International Space Station, with the promise that it would be retrieved only when the next American crew launched from U.S. soil. Now, nearly a decade later, Hurley himself was returning to claim it. The journey ahead was carefully mapped. After launch, Falcon 9 would carry Dragon into orbit in just 10 minutes. The rocket's first stage would detach and attempt to control landing back on Earth, a feat no other rocket in history had accomplished so consistently. Meanwhile, Dragon would begin its orbital chase of the ISS, adjusting its trajectory until it could dock fully autonomously with the station. Once there, Behnken and Hurley would remain for weeks, perhaps months, testing every system of Dragon in real-world conditions. And when the mission was complete, the capsule would undock, re-enter Earth's atmosphere, and splash down in the Atlantic Ocean, a return to an older method not seen since the Apollo days. The risks were real. Just a year before, a Crew Dragon capsule had exploded during a ground test, a reminder that progress came only through trial and error. Boeing, too, had faced setbacks, with its Starliner capsule failing to reach the station during an uncrewed test due to a software error. Spaceflight remained as dangerous as ever. Yet it was precisely in that danger that the meaning of this mission was found. Exploration had never been about safety. It had always been about risk, courage, and the willingness to venture into the unknown despite the odds. And so, on that day, the eyes of the world turned once more to the skies above Florida, to the launch pad where Apollo had once begun its journey to the moon. History was about to be written again, this time not by a government agency alone, but by the merging of public ambition and private innovation. The countdown to launch was not just measured in hours and minutes. It was measured in decades of progress, failures, and dreams that had led to this moment. For many engineers at NASA and SpaceX, this was a culmination of their careers. Some had been fresh college graduates when the space shuttle retired in 2011. Now, years later, they stood on console, monitoring data in real time, knowing that the lives of 2 astronauts and the credibility of their entire program rested in their hands. Inside the crew quarters, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley began a familiar, yet always tense process of suiting up. The sleek white pressure suits were carefully checked by technicians who had rehearsed these steps hundreds of times. Every zipper, every connection, every communication link had to be perfect. One malfunction, one unnoticed detail, could compromise the mission. The suits themselves represented a leap forward from the bulky garments of earlier generations. With integrated communications, adjustable pressure systems, and streamlined design, they were as much symbols of SpaceX's futuristic vision as they were tools of survival. When suited, the astronauts walked the traditional Astro Walk toward the waiting Tesla cars that would drive them to the launch pad. In the past, the iconic silver Astrovan had carried shuttle crews to their rockets. Now, electric cars, another product of Musk's empire, became part of the ritual. Cameras captured every step, beamed to millions watching around the world. For many, this was a moment of pride, a reminder that even in the midst of global uncertainty and a pandemic, humanity still reached upward, still sought something beyond its immediate struggles. At the launch pad, the Falcon 9 awaited, secured by the strong back structure that would tilt away at the final moments before launch. The rocket's black and white paint gleamed in the sunlight, its aerodynamic lines a fusion of strength and elegance. Engineers checked the fueling lines, monitoring the liquid oxygen and RP-1 kerosene that would power the engines. The process of fueling a rocket was always tense. The temperatures involved were extreme, the pressure enormous. A single leak could spell disaster. But this, too, had been practiced, refined, and perfected through dozens of previous Falcon launches. Bob and Doug entered the Crew Dragon capsule, climbing into their seats.
Look at
The interior, dominated by touchscreens, looked more like the cockpit of a futuristic aircraft in the cramped, button-filled spaces of Apollo or Shuttle. Each astronaut plugged their suit into the seat, linking life support systems directly with Dragon. They tested microphones, communications, suit pressure, oxygen flow. Everything was monitored both by SpaceX's control center in Hawthorne, California, and NASA's mission control in Houston, Texas. For the first time in history, 2 command centers, one public, one private, shared responsibility for human spaceflight. As the countdown moved into its final stages, tension grew. Outside, there were no vast crowds on the beaches due to the pandemic. Yet millions tuned in online, creating one of the most watched live streams in history. Children, teachers, space enthusiasts, and ordinary citizens followed the ticking clock. For many young viewers, this was their first time witnessing an American launch. For older generations, memories of Apollo and Shuttle stirred once more. The engines of Falcon 9 roared to life with thunder that shook the ground for miles. Fire and smoke engulfed the pad as the rocket slowly lifted, gathering speed, climbing higher and higher into the sky. In that instant, history turned a page. American astronauts were leaving Earth from American soil once again, not in a government-owned shuttle, but in a spacecraft built by a private company. Inside Dragon, The astronauts felt the increasing force of gravity pressing them back into their seats. The first stage engines pushed with nearly 2 million pounds of thrust, a controlled explosion that hurled the vehicle upward. Through their helmets, they could hear the constant stream of data from mission control. Altitude, speed, trajectory, all unfolding second by second. At around 2.5 minutes into flight, the first stage engines shut down. The rocket separated, leaving the second stage to ignite and continue the climb into orbit. For a brief moment, weightlessness returned before the push of acceleration resumed.
It's incredible.
Down below,
look at the energy
cameras
it's giving
captured the
off.
first stage flipping itself around, firing small thrusters to stabilize as it began its journey back to Earth. This was one of the defining features of Falcon 9, reusability. While the second stage carried Dragon toward orbit, the first stage was not discarded into the ocean. Instead, it steered itself toward a landing zone on a floating barge in the Atlantic Ocean, a massive drone ship appropriately named, of course, I Still Love You. Millions watched as the cameras followed its descent. The landing legs deployed, and with a controlled burn, the booster touched down gently on the deck. Applause erupted at SpaceX's control center. Another successful landing, another step toward making spaceflight sustainable. Meanwhile, Dragon continued on its path to orbit. In less than 10 minutes, the spacecraft and its crew were free of Earth's atmosphere, circling the planet at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. The mission had cleared its most dangerous phase, launch. Yet much work remained. Over the next 19 hours, Dragon would slowly adjust its orbit, chasing the International Space Station. It was a delicate ballet of speed and precision. Approaching too fast could cause collision, too slow, and rendezvous would fail. The spacecraft's autonomous systems handled the complex navigation, but Bob and Doug were ready to take manual control if necessary. For testing purposes, NASA required them to briefly pilot Dragon themselves, ensuring that in any future emergency, astronauts would not be helpless passengers. As Dragon orbited Earth, the astronauts caught glimpses of the blue planet through its windows. The vast oceans, swirling clouds, and faint outlines of continents reminded them of the fragility of their home. From space, Earth seemed small, unified, without borders, just a sphere of life suspended in darkness. For centuries, poets, scientists, and dreamers had imagined this perspective. For Bob and Doug, it was now reality once more. The next day, Dragon approached the ISS, a gleaming laboratory orbiting 400 kilometers above Earth. The station had been continuously inhabited for nearly 2 decades, a symbol of international cooperation. Russians, Americans, Europeans, Japanese, and Canadians all lived and worked together aboard it. Now, SpaceX's arrival represented a new chapter. As Dragon inched closer, its sensors scanned the station, aligning perfectly with the docking port. Slowly, carefully, it attached itself with a satisfying click. For the first time in history, a privately built spacecraft carrying humans had docked with the ISS. Cheers erupted once more in mission control. NASA, SpaceX, and space enthusiasts worldwide celebrated the achievement. This was more than a mission. It was proof that a partnership between government and private industry could accomplish what once seemed impossible. Bob and Doug floated to the hatch, greeted by the crew already aboard the station. Their journey had carried them not only into space, but into history. For weeks ahead, they would test Dragon systems, assist with scientific experiments, and continue the work of exploration. But for now, the moment was one of triumph, relief, and pride. Life aboard the International Space Station had always been a mix of routine and wonder, but with the arrival of Crew Dragon, there was an undeniable sense of renewal. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, now floating freely in the microgravity environment, began the long process of adapting their bodies to life in orbit once again. Both men were veteran astronauts, having flown on the space shuttle, but every spacecraft carried its own unique rhythms, its own quirks, its own demands. The first hours were devoted to checkouts, ensuring Dragon systems remained stable even while docked. The capsule was a guest of the station, but it was also a lifeboat. Should anything go wrong aboard the ISS, Bob and Doug would retreat to Dragon, seal the hatch, and be ready to undock within minutes. That redundancy, that layer of protection, was part of NASA's safety doctrine. Space had never been forgiven.
Incredible.
Once formalities were over, the two astronauts joined their colleagues already stationed in orbit, floating embraces, smiles that drifted in weightlessness. These were the human touches behind the technological achievement. They shared messages with their families back on Earth, knowing millions were still watching, still inspired. For children tuning in, these weren't just astronauts. They were living proof that space travel remained alive, dynamic, and open to the next generation. Their daily schedule aboard the ISS was packed with tasks. Scientific experiments occupied a large portion of their time, studying how microgravity affected human physiology, testing fluid dynamics and weightlessness, monitoring plant growth in small orbital greenhouses. Each experiment carried potential insights not only for future space travel, but also for life on Earth. Medicines, materials, agricultural techniques. Many innovations born in orbit eventually filtered down to everyday human use. But spaceflight also demanded physical discipline. Every astronaut spent around 2 hours each day exercising. Without gravity, muscles and bones weakened rapidly. Treadmills were bolted to the station walls, and resistance machines simulated weightlifting through vacuum cylinders. Straps and harnesses kept the astronauts from floating away mid-workout. It was a strange sight. Men and women running on treadmills with elastic bands pinning them down, lifting weights that weren't weights at all, and cycling on stationary bikes while floating in the air. Yet these regimens were essential. Every heartbeat, every drop of sweat was data, teaching scientists how the human body could endure months, and one day, years, away from Earth. Even meals were both routine and experiment. Packets of rehydrated food, tortillas instead of bread to avoid floating crumbs, drinks sipped through straws. Flavor mattered more than ever. Astronauts craved spicier, tangier tastes, as microgravity dulled the sense of flavor. A dash of hot sauce, a packet of mustard, a spoonful of peanut butter.
It's incredible.
Small luxuries that connected them to Earth. Crew Dragon itself became a focal point of testing. Unlike the shuttle, which had hundreds of manual switches, Dragon relied almost entirely on touchscreen interfaces. Bob and Doug practiced simulated scenarios, docking manually, adjusting orbits, initiating emergency procedures. The capsule software had to respond instantly, and the astronauts' input provided feedback for future missions. Was the interface intuitive in gloves? Did the displays provide enough redundancy? Could a pilot react quickly under stress? These were questions only real-world testing could answer. Meanwhile, down on Earth, the mission's ripple effects were immense. SpaceX's success applied pressure on Boeing, NASA's other partner in the Commercial Crew Program. Boeing's CST-100 Starliner had suffered setbacks in testing, and now the world saw SpaceX pulling ahead, delivering astronauts safely while Boeing struggled with delays. For the first time in decades, there was competition in human spaceflight within the United States. Competition that promised to drive innovation further. Politically, the mission became a symbol. U.S. leaders praised it as proof of American ingenuity and resilience. In Congress, debates shifted. Should NASA continue building its own spacecraft for deep space missions, or should private companies take the lead? With NASA acting as coordinator and customer? The implications were profound. For decades, space exploration had been the realm of governments. Now, corporations were stepping into roles once reserved for national pride. Critics warned of over-commercialization. Supporters hailed a new era of accessibility. In Europe, Asia, and beyond, space agencies watched closely. Could they, too, benefit from partnerships with private firms? Already, smaller companies were dreaming of tourist flights, lunar landers, even asteroid mining. The success of Crew Dragon was not just a win for the U.S. It was a signal to the entire world that space was opening to new players.
It's incredible.
Back on the ISS,
Look at the energy it's
Bob and Doug settled into the rhythm of orbital life. Earth drifted below them, a constantly changing canvas of oceans, deserts, and city lights. They often paused in their work just to gaze out of the cupola, the station's panoramic window. Sunrises and sunsets swept past every 90 minutes, painting the planet in fiery reds and deep blues. Thunderstorms flashed across continents, lightning dancing like veins across the darkened surface. From this vantage, Earth was both fragile and magnificent, a home worth protecting. They also became communicators. Live streams and video calls connected them with classrooms, journalists, and the public. Space travel, once cloaked in mystery, now unfolded in real time across the internet. Students could ask questions directly, inspiring a new generation of scientists, engineers, and explorers. And yet, amid the wonder, there were constant reminders of risk. Every orbit, the station had to track potential space debris, remnants of old satellites, fragments of rockets, shards from past collisions. Even a bolt the size of a marble could puncture the station at orbital speeds. Alarms sometimes forced the crew to retreat into their spacecraft, ready to evacuate if necessary. The dangers of space were ever present, invisible but real. Crew Dragon itself carried improvements for safety. Unlike the shuttle, which had no escape system once its boosters ignited, Dragon had powerful Super Draco engines built into its hull. In case of a launch emergency, those engines could fire instantly, pulling the capsule away from an exploding rocket. This escape capability was demonstrated in dramatic tests before the mission, giving astronauts greater confidence that their lives would not be left to chance. NASA emphasized that every success was built on the lessons of past tragedies. Apollo 1, Challenger, Columbia, those losses had scarred the space community. But they also instilled a culture of vigilance. Nothing was taken for granted. Every checklist, every simulation, every layer of redundancy existed because of hard-learned lessons. Bob and Doug carried the memory of fallen astronauts with them, knowing that each safe mission honored their legacy. As days turned into weeks aboard the ISS, the presence of Crew Dragon remained a constant reminder of change. For the astronauts already living on the station, Dragon was more than a visiting vehicle. It was a promise of continuity. For years, they had depended solely on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft to ferry crews up and down. While reliable, Soyuz carried only 3 astronauts at a time and required months of preparation. Now, Dragon's arrival meant larger crews, more experiments, and a fresh sense of independence for NASA and its partners. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley began documenting their experiences with Dragon in extraordinary detail. Every interface they used, every alert they heard, every small comfort or frustration was logged. Spacecraft are never finished products. They evolve. SpaceX engineers on the ground awaited this feedback eagerly, ready to refine designs for future missions. Unlike traditional aerospace companies, which often move cautiously and bureaucratically, SpaceX thrived on rapid iteration. Small lessons from Bob and Doug stay would directly shape Crew 2, Crew 3, and beyond. One of the key systems under evaluation was Dragon's environmental control. Inside, the capsule had to maintain a delicate balance of temperature, humidity, and oxygen. In microgravity, even simple things like airflow mattered deeply. Without proper circulation, carbon dioxide could form invisible pockets around astronauts' heads, leading to suffocation. Fans and filters ran constantly, moving the air in carefully calculated currents. Bob and Doug checked sensors daily, confirming that the system kept the atmosphere comfortable. These details, though invisible to viewers back on Earth, were the difference between a safe spacecraft and a lethal one. Meanwhile, their work aboard the station carried symbolic weight. They assisted in spacewalks, venturing outside the ISS to replace aging batteries on the solar arrays. These excursions were physically demanding. Each lasted 6 to 7 hours, with the astronauts encased in bulky EMU suits. Outside, Earth rolled endlessly beneath their feet, a dazzling yet humbling sight. Bob, in particular, became known for his calm, meticulous approach during these spacewalks, earning praise from both NASA and SpaceX. Back on Earth, public enthusiasm surged. SpaceX became a household name, not only among space enthusiasts, but among ordinary families. Children drew pictures of rockets and capsules, classrooms streamed ISS updates, and media outlets tracked every detail of Dragon's journey. For the first time in decades, astronauts had returned to the cultural spotlight, not as distant heroes, but as relatable figures whose every move could be followed online. The symbolism extended further. Internationally, countries recognized that something fundamental had shifted. The U.S. was no longer merely a government-run spacefaring nation. It now had a commercial gateway to orbit. The message was clear. Space was becoming more accessible, more open to partnerships, more connected to the private sector. China, Russia, Europe, and India all took note. Some saw competition. Others saw opportunity. But no one ignored it. For Bob and Doug, the rhythm of life aboard the ISS remained relentless. Each day brought new experiments. Combustion tests of microgravity, crystal growth medical research. They monitor how the absence of gravity affected fluids, flames, and biological processes. Each experiment held potential implications back on Earth. For example, protein crystal growth studies could lead to breakthroughs in drug development. Materials research could inspire stronger alloys or more efficient electronics. In this sense, the ISS was not just a laboratory for space. It was a laboratory for humanity. Dragon itself underwent tests even while docked. Power systems, thermal controls, and navigation sensors were checked repeatedly.
Look at the energy it's
SpaceX wanted to prove that the spacecraft could remain in orbit for extended durations, acting as both a crew transporter and a reliable escape vehicle. Any anomaly, no matter how minor, was recorded and transmitted to engineers. The data pipeline between the ISS, NASA, and SpaceX's Hawthorne headquarters became a living artery of information. But while technology was a backbone, the human story was the beating heart. The astronauts maintained contact with their families through scheduled video calls. Bob's young son, Theo, became a quiet star of these interactions, often appearing in news coverage as he spoke with his father from Earth. Doug's family, too, sent messages of love and encouragement. For the astronauts, these brief moments of connection bridged the gap between isolation in orbit and life back home. And all the while, Crew Dragon's sleek design became a point of fascination. Reporters marveled at its minimalist interior, journalists compared it to science fiction films, and aerospace veterans noted how far spacecraft had come since the days of Apollo. Touch screens replaced toggle switches. Modern seats replaced metal frames. Yet beneath the polish, Dragon carried robust redundancies, triple-layered systems, manual overrides, hardened software. SpaceX had managed a merge style with survival. As weeks passed, discussions turned to the mission's larger meaning. This was not just about ferrying astronauts to the ISS. It was about proving a model that private industry, under government oversight, could safely transport humans into space. If this model succeeded, the implications were enormous. Not just cheaper access to orbit, but entirely new economies. Space tourism, lunar bases, asteroid mining, even Mars colonization, all of it hinged on lowering costs and raising reliability. Crew Dragon was the first proof that such a system could work. And then there was the booster, the Falcon 9 first stage that had carried Bob and Doug skyward. It sat safely on its drone ship, awaiting refurbishment.
It's incredible.
For decades,
Look at the
rockets have
energy
been
it's
discarded like empty shells. SpaceX had broken that paradigm. Reusability wasn't just an engineering trick. It was an economic revolution. Every booster that landed safely meant millions saved, millions that could be reinvested into pushing further outward. The more often they flew, the cheaper each mission became. For NASA, this was both liberating and sobering. The agency could now refocus on deep space goals, returning humans to the moon, planning missions to Mars, while delegating routine low Earth orbit transport to commercial partners. But it also raised questions. If private companies controlled access to orbit, what role would national space agencies play in the long term? Would exploration become privatized, or would a balance emerge between public vision and private capability? The debates grew louder, but in orbit, Bob and Doug focused on their tasks. They lived the reality while the world argued over the meaning. Each day, as Earth rolled endlessly beneath them, they embodied the bridge between past and future. They were veterans of the shuttle, now testing the craft that would carry a new generation. They were both witnesses to history and authors of it. Even as Bob and Doug carried out their duties on the station, the very fact of their presence began to reshape global perspectives on spaceflight. The International Space Station, once a symbol of fragile international cooperation, now stood at the crossroads of old alliances and new economic realities. For nearly a decade, NASA had paid Russia billions of dollars for seats on Soyuz. Now, with Crew Dragon docked and operational, that monopoly was broken. It wasn't just about money. It was about autonomy, prestige, and the ability to choose one's own path to orbit. The Russian space agency, Roscosmos, reacted with a mix of pride and caution. On one hand, they had long carried the weight of ensuring American access to space. Their Soyuz craft had proven their worth time and again. On the other hand, they knew that a new chapter had begun. Roscosmos officials congratulated NASA and SpaceX publicly. But behind closed doors, they began discussing what the next era of Russian spaceflight should look like. Could they compete with private sector speed and innovation? Or would Russia have to form deeper partnerships with China, whose space program was expanding rapidly? For the astronauts living aboard the ISS, these geopolitical ripples were distant but not irrelevant. Space crews had always lived by the creed of cooperation, regardless of their nation's politics. Yet they could not help but sense that history was shifting around them. Conversations over shared meals often touched on the future. Would multinational crews one day board spacecraft not owned by any government but by corporations? Would the next generation of explorers, with the logos of private companies alongside their national flags? Inside Crew Dragon itself, automated systems continued to hum steadily. The spacecraft was in what engineers called quiescent mode, conserving energy and resources while docked, but always ready to act as a lifeboat in case of emergency. That lifeboat capability was not theoretical. On the ISS, the crew must always have a way home. For years, Soyuz capsules had provided that assurance. Now Dragon joined them, sleek and modern, sitting like a coiled spring, ready to ignite its engines if disaster struck. Bob and Doug, though veterans, felt the subtle weight of being pioneers once again. Every test they ran, every system they evaluated, was part of proving that future astronauts would be safe. They often spoke in their video updates about the responsibility they carried, not just to themselves, but to the generations that would come after them. Space flight was never about a single mission. It was about continuity. Every safe landing, every lesson learned, paved the road to the next horizon. Back on Earth, SpaceX engineers monitored Dragon continuously. Data streams flowed into Hawthorne, California, where rows of specialists analyzed temperatures, voltages, pressures, and software performance. Even minor fluctuations were studied, compared against simulations, and logged for future missions. The company's philosophy was simple: learn fast, fix fast, fly again. It was a mindset that had allowed them to dominate the launch market, and now it was being applied to human spaceflight with unprecedented intensity. Meanwhile, the public relations impact was enormous. SpaceX broadcasts drew millions of viewers online, rivaling sports events in their scale. Children wore T-shirts with Falcon 9 rockets on them. Teachers used Crew Dragon's journey as a real-time educational tool in classrooms, explaining orbital mechanics, rocket reusability, and the history of exploration. The mission was no longer confined to engineers and astronauts. It belonged to everyone who dreamed of reaching beyond Earth. Inside the ISS, Bob and Doug experienced the peculiar rhythm of orbital life. 16 sunrises and sunsets each day, each one painting Earth in brilliant hues of orange and blue. The constant drift of continents below. The absence of weight, which turned every movement into a dance. Meals packaged in small containers, carefully labeled, eaten with magnetic utensils. Sleep strapped inside small crew quarters, with a laptop or family photo floating nearby. These were the intimate realities of life in space, mundane to those who lived them, yet awe-inspiring to those who watched from below. NASA psychologists paid close attention to how the crew adapted. Isolation and confinement in space bore uncanny similarities to the conditions millions on Earth were experiencing during the global pandemic. In both places, routines, communication, and mental resilience were critical. Bob and Doug spoke candidly about the importance of discipline, waking at consistent hours, exercising daily, maintaining social bonds through video calls. Their words resonated not just as astronauts, but as fellow humans navigating uncertain times. As weeks stretched into months, the question of their return loomed larger. Dragon had proven itself in orbit, but re-entry was the ultimate test. Unlike the space shuttle, which glided to a runway landing, Dragon would return like the Apollo capsules before it, plunging into Earth's atmosphere, protected by an advanced heat shield and splashing down in the ocean. For modern audiences, this seemed almost nostalgic. For engineers, it was a critical opportunity to validate new materials and designs. The Pica X heat shield on Dragon was a marvel of modern engineering. Built to withstand temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it represented years of refinement. Each re-entry would burn away a thin outer layer, but the shield itself was designed to endure multiple flights. Engineers at SpaceX spoke of it with the same reverence that past generations had for Saturn V engines or shuttle tiles. It was a line between survival and catastrophe. Bob and Doug were trained for every scenario. Smooth re-entry, parachute deployment, capsule recovery. But they were also trained for failures. Parachutes that didn't open, capsules that missed their mark, emergencies requiring rapid extraction. As veterans, they carried no illusions about the dangers. Yet they spoke of their return with calm confidence. To them, risk was not an obstacle. It was the price of progress. On Earth, recovery teams prepared as diligently as the astronauts. Ships were readied in the Atlantic. Helicopters were staged. Divers rehearsed the procedures of approaching and securing the capsule. Even the smallest details mattered. How to open a hatch safely, how to stabilize astronauts who might be disoriented after months in microgravity, how to transport them swiftly to medical facilities. The choreography of recovery was as critical as the ballet of launch. But before they could come home, more work remained. The ISS schedule never slowed. Bob and Doug joined their colleagues in maintaining experiments, repairing systems, and conducting outreach. Each task was a reminder that space was not a destination, but a workplace, a fragile outpost where every action mattered. They knew that soon their days in orbit would end, but the data they collected, the systems they tested, and the memories they forged would ripple outward for years to come. And always, in the back of their minds, there was the awareness of history. They were part of a lineage stretching back through the Shuttle, Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury. Each generation of astronauts had faced the unknown, and each had added its own chapter. Now it was their turn, and they carried the weight with quiet determination. As the mission stretched on, one of the most fascinating aspects wasn't just the spacecraft itself, but the human adaptation to life in orbit. Every astronaut, no matter how seasoned, undergoes a process of adjustment when living aboard the International Space Station. For Bob and Doug, it was no different. Their bodies began to adapt in subtle yet profound ways. Without the constant pull of Earth's gravity, fluids shifted toward the upper body. Faces looked puffy, legs thinned out, and sinuses felt perpetually congested. Vision could even blur, a phenomenon known as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS. Scientists on Earth monitored these changes closely, using every mission as a chance to better understand the human body in microgravity. Exercise was a daily requirement. Astronauts aboard the ISS typically devote nearly 2 hours a day to physical activity, using specialized machines that simulate weightlifting and cardio. Without such exercise, muscles would weaken and bones would lose density at alarming rates. Bob and Doug often filmed parts of their workouts, showing the world how they ran on treadmills with harnesses that pulled them down, or lifted weighted bars that were actually powered by resistance mechanisms instead of gravity. These sessions were not just about staying fit for their return home. They were critical scientific data points about how humans might one day survive on missions lasting years, such as journeys to Mars. Beyond the physical demands, there are also the psychological challenges of confinement and distance. Though they had video calls, emails, and occasional live interactions with their families, the sense of isolation was undeniable. The ISS was large compared to earlier spacecraft, yet still limited. The same faces, the same metallic corridors, the same routines repeated endlessly. To combat monotony, astronauts cultivated rituals. Movie nights, shared meals, even small celebrations of Earth holidays. Bob and Doug participated fully, their presence adding fresh energy to the station's tight-knit community. Meanwhile, Crew Dragon continued to function as a silent sentinel, docked firmly to the ISS. Its systems ran in low-power mode, but every circuit, every battery, every communication pathway was tested and retested. SpaceX engineers, watching from Hawthorne, treated Dragon almost like a newborn child, fragile, precious, constantly monitored. This wasn't paranoia, it was necessity. The spacecraft was both transport and lifeboat, a guarantee that if anything went wrong on the station, Bob and Doug would have a way home. Outside the station, Earth rolled by in a ceaseless panorama. Astronauts often described the view as spiritual. From orbit, national borders vanished. Mountains, oceans, deserts, and cities appeared in vivid clarity, bathed in the shifting light of dawn and dusk. Lightning storms flashed across continents. Auroras danced at the poles, ribbons of green and red sweeping across the planet's magnetic fields. Bob and Doug, like so many before them, found themselves humbled by the sight. They often spoke about the overview effect, the psychological shift that comes from seeing Earth as one fragile, interconnected whole. It was a perspective that resonated deeply, especially during a time when the world below grappled with division, uncertainty, and a global pandemic. Public interest back on Earth never waned. Every update, every video call, every tweet from space was followed eagerly. SpaceX's marketing of the mission was deliberate yet authentic. The company understood that storytelling mattered as much as engineering. Footage of Dragon's sleek interior, of astronauts floating gracefully in their new suits, of Falcon 9's booster landing upright on a drone ship. All to build a narrative of progress, hope, and daring. Spaceflight had always been about symbolism as well as science. And in this era, the symbol spread instantly across digital platforms, inspiring millions who might never have looked up before. For NASA, the mission validated years of effort to reimagine its relationship with the private sector. No longer was the agency the sole builder and operator of spacecraft. Instead, it had become a customer, purchasing services from companies like SpaceX and Boeing. The shift was not without controversy. Critics argued that outsourcing risked placing too much power in private hands, where profit motives could clash with safety. Supporters countered that competition spurred innovation, reducing costs and expanding capabilities. For now, the success of Bob and Doug's mission lent weight to the latter argument. Yet behind the scenes, the risks were never forgotten. Spaceflight has always been unforgiving. Every valve, every seal, every line of code had to function perfectly. The smallest oversight could prove catastrophic. NASA's culture of caution blended uneasily with SpaceX's ethos of rapid iteration. And yet, this unlikely partnership had found a balance. Bob and Doug's safety depended on it, as were the lives of every crew to come. The astronauts themselves felt this balance acutely. They were test pilots, after all, trained to assess risks and push boundaries. Every switch they toggled, every screen they touched, was an evaluation not just of their mission, but for those who would follow. In many ways, their role was less about exploration and more about certification. They were proving that Dragon was not just a machine, but a reliable bridge between Earth and orbit. As their stay continued, the world below began to discuss what might come next. SpaceX openly spoke of Starship, its massive, fully reusable spacecraft designed to carry not just crews, but entire colonies to Mars. The audacity of the vision captured imaginations and stirred debates. Was humanity truly on the verge of becoming a multiplanetary species? Or was this a dream too vast to achieve? Bob and Doug's mission didn't answer that question, but it made one thing undeniable. The path forward was open in a way it hadn't been for decades. And while SpaceX dreamed of Mars, NASA looked toward the moon. The Artemis program promised to return humans to lunar soil, this time with international and commercial partners. The synergy between Dragon, Falcon 9, and future missions became clear. Low Earth orbit could be managed by commercial spacecraft, freeing NASA to focus on deep space. Dragon was not the destination. It was a foundation. Still, before that future could unfold, one test remained. Dragon had to bring Bob and Doug home safely. Re-entry is one of the most dangerous phases of any mission. The capsule would need to withstand blistering heat, decelerate rapidly from orbital speeds, and deploy parachutes flawlessly to land softly in the ocean. Every system had been tested countless times, but tests are not the same as reality. The astronauts were keenly aware of this. The end of their mission would be as perilous as the beginning, but that moment was still ahead. For now, their work continued, their days filled with experiments, maintenance, and communication with Earth. Each sunrise brought another cycle of science and discovery. Each orbit reminded them of the fragility and beauty of the planet they had left behind. And each night, as they floated in their sleeping quarters, they knew they were living not just their own story, but humanity's. Life aboard the ISS unfolded in rhythms both familiar and surreal. Every 90 minutes, the station completed a full orbit of Earth. That meant Bob and Doug witnessed 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets each day. The spectacle never grew old, though it did complicate their circadian rhythms. The human body is designed for a 24-hour cycle, regulated by light and darkness.
Look at the
in
energy
orbit,
it's giving off.
where night and day pass in less than 2 hours, sleep can be elusive. To adapt, the crew relied on carefully timed schedules and sometimes used masks or special lighting systems designed to mimic Earth's day-night patterns. This constant cycle of light and shadow became a metaphor for their mission, a balance of wonder and discipline. Between moments of awe at the Earth below, there was work, always work. NASA schedules were famously packed. Every experiment had its slot, every maintenance task its deadline. Bob and Doug moved between fluid dynamic studies, material science projects, biological experiments, and Earth observation tasks. The ISS was not just a habitat. It was a laboratory, a factory of knowledge orbiting high above the planet. One experiment that fascinated both astronauts involved the behavior of fire in microgravity. On Earth, flames rise because heated air becomes less dense and rises, pulling cooler air in below. In space, without gravity to drive convection, flames behave differently. They form small, blue, spherical shapes, burning at lower temperatures and producing fewer byproducts. Studying these flames offered insights not only into fundamental physics, but also into fire safety for future missions. Another area of research focused on human health. Blood samples, saliva swabs, and even muscle biopsies were collected to study how space travel affects immune function, cardiovascular systems, and cellular structures. These weren't just academic pursuits. They were essential for long-duration missions. If humans were ever to spend years traveling to Mars, understanding how to maintain health in space was non-negotiable. Bob and Doug's bodies became part of that grand experiment. Beyond the science, there was the ever-present question of mental resilience. Astronauts often describe space as beautiful yet lonely, thrilling yet repetitive. The ISS might seem spacious compared to earlier spacecraft, but it was still only about the size of a football field, with crew members living in a fraction of that space. Privacy was minimal. Stress was constant. The tiniest disagreement, magnified by confinement, could strain relationships. NASA psychologists provided support, scheduling regular private conferences with crew members to check on their emotional well-being. Bob and Doug, both seasoned test pilots, were trained to handle stress, but even they spoke about the importance of humor, camaraderie, and small rituals to keep morale high. Technology bridged the distance between orbit and Earth. Video calls allowed them to speak with family, a lifeline that astronauts from earlier eras could scarcely imagine. Emails and recorded messages also flowed back and forth. Yet there were moments of silence, too, times when communication was delayed or unavailable. In those gaps, the vastness of space felt all the more real. Meanwhile, on Earth, the mission had become more than a technical achievement. It was a cultural event. Media outlets carried daily updates. Social platforms buzzed with clips of Dragon's sleek interior, of astronauts floating through its touchscreen-controlled cabin, of Falcon 9 boosters landing upright with uncanny precision. Children drew pictures of rockets. Teachers used a mission in their lessons, and ordinary people, many of whom had never thought much about space, found themselves captivated. For SpaceX, this was validation not only of technology but of philosophy. Elon Musk's vision of a multiplanetary future had often been dismissed as fantasy, but here was tangible proof. Human beings fly into space in a privately built craft, returning NASA's crewed launch capability to American soil after nearly a decade of dependence on Russia. The symbolism was powerful. The United States had reasserted itself in human spaceflight, not through government alone, but through a hybrid partnership with the private sector. Yet behind every headline lay an undercurrent of caution. Engineers at NASA and SpaceX knew too well the history of spaceflight. The Apollo 1 fire, Challenger's explosion, Columbia's disintegration. Each tragedy had been a reminder that the margin for error was razor thin. Even as Bob and Doug orbited safely, teams on the ground pored over data, looking for anomalies, preparing contingencies. Safety reviews were constant. Redundancies were checked and rechecked. In quieter moments, the astronauts themselves reflected on their unique position. They were pioneers, yes, but also test subjects and ambassadors. Their mission was as much about proving a system as it was about exploration. Every switch they pressed, every log they updated, was part of a chain that would one day allow more routine space travel. For the first time, the idea of ordinary citizens, tourists, researchers, entrepreneurs, visiting orbit no longer seemed distant. Dragon was designed with scalability in mind. It wasn't hard to imagine a future where its cabins were filled not with test pilots, but with teachers, artists, or private travelers. Looking out the window, Earth itself reminded them of what was at stake. The thin blue line of atmosphere appeared almost fragile, barely clinging to the planet. From orbit, pollution, deforestation, and sprawling cities were visible alongside breathtaking natural beauty. The juxtaposition was striking. Many astronauts had described this view as transformative, and Bob and Doug felt it too. They often spoke about the need to protect Earth, to treat space exploration not as an escape, but as a call to stewardship of the only home humanity currently had. At the same time, they were aware that their mission was part of a much larger geopolitical and economic landscape. Space had always been a stage for competition. In the Cold War, it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union racing for prestige. Now, new players like China, India, and private companies worldwide were shaping the next chapter. The success of Dragon sent a clear message. Access to space was no longer the exclusive domain of governments. A new era had begun, one where innovation and ambition could emerge from unlikely places. And so, day by day, orbit by orbit, the mission stretched on. Experiments were completed, systems checked, routines followed. But always, hovering at the edges of their thoughts, was the knowledge that the hardest part still awaited them. Launch and docking had been triumphs, but re-entry, descent, and splashdown would be the final trial. For now, however, the crew focused on the present. They laughed during shared meals, marveled at lightning storms flickering across continents, and pressed their foreheads to the windows to watch the aurora sweep across the poles. Their lives were tethered to a thin shell of aluminum, racing endlessly around Earth at 17,500 miles per hour. Yet within that shell, they found a sense of purpose, connection, and even peace. Inside the station, time was measured not in hours, but in tasks. Every morning began with a daily planning conference between the crew and mission control centers scattered across the globe. Houston in the United States, Tsukuba in Japan, Moscow in Russia, Cologne in Germany. Each center managed its nation's contributions to the ISS, and together they orchestrated a schedule that kept the station humming like a living organism. Bob and Doug logged into these calls from their laptop screens, floating upright with Velcro straps holding their notepads in place. The coordination was meticulous. When one astronaut was setting up an experiment in the Japanese Kibo module, another was repairing a filter in a Russian Zvezda service module, while others prepared cargo in the U.S. Destiny laboratory. Every screw turned, every cable plugged, every scientific sample stored had ripple effects across the orbiting outpost. Their personal quarters offered the only semblance of solitude. Each astronaut had a tiny sleeping pod, not much larger than a closet. Inside were sleeping bags tethered to walls, personal photos, a laptop, and sometimes a book or a musical instrument. Floating inside, they could zip themselves in, shut the hatch, and escape, at least for a little while, from the constant presence of others. Bob once joked that his small pod, though windowless, felt like a space cabin in the woods, a retreat where silence would be found in the endless hum of ventilation fans. Meals were another daily anchor. Food aboard the ISS was packaged, freeze-dried, and carefully rationed, but shared dinners became important bonding rituals. They often gathered around a table that wasn't a table at all, just a panel with straps and magnetic strips to hold their utensils in place. Tortillas replaced bread because they didn't crumble into dangerous floating particles. Drinks came in pouches with straws fitted with one-way valves. Sometimes, crew members improvised, mixing ingredients to create makeshift recipes. Doug once combined tortillas, peanut butter, and honey into what he proudly called space tacos. These little acts of creativity gave them a sense of normalcy, a reminder of life on Earth. Outside their windows, the Earth told its own story. From 400 kilometers above, Bob and Doug observed patterns invisible from the ground. The Amazon rainforest appeared as an ocean of green, punctuated by scars of deforestation. The Sahara stretched endlessly, dunes casting shadows like ripples on a golden sea. Rivers glowed silver under the sunlight, winding like threads across continents. At night, cities revealed themselves as constellations of light, proof of humanity's vast reach. From space, political boundaries vanished. Only the raw geography of the planet remained. And then there were the storms. Thunderheads towered high into the atmosphere, their tops glowing in the sun, while lightning flickered beneath like a pulse. Hurricanes spun like perfect spirals, beautiful yet terrifying in their immensity. Seeing such phenomena from orbit gave the astronauts a sense of both wonder and fragility, the immense power of nature and the thin veil of atmosphere that shielded all life below. Not all observations were visual. Instruments aboard the ISS constantly measured radiation levels, atmospheric composition, and solar activity. Space was far from empty. It was alive with streams of particles and waves of energy. Bob and Doug participated in monitoring radiation exposure, as cosmic rays pose long-term health risks for astronauts. Shielding aboard the ISS provided some protection, but the data collected would be crucial for future missions beyond Earth's magnetic field, where such radiation was far more dangerous. Meanwhile, engineers on Earth watched over Dragon like anxious parents. The spacecraft remained powered down to conserve energy, but periodic health checks confirmed its readiness. Every few days, systems were briefly awakened, sensors tested, and logs transmitted back to SpaceX's mission control in Hawthorne, California. Each successful check brought relief, but the knowledge lingered. When it came time to undock, Dragon would be called upon to perform flawlessly in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. For SpaceX employees, many of whom had grown up idolizing NASA's shuttle program, seeing their craft safely attached to the ISS was deeply personal. Late nights at the factory, thousands of hours of design reviews, endless simulations, all of it had culminated in this mission. Yet they also knew it wasn't the finish line, just a milestone. Elon Musk's speeches often reminded them that their true goal was not just to fly to orbit, but to build the systems that would carry humanity into the solar system. Back aboard the ISS, life continued with rituals both mundane and profound. On Sundays, when the workload was lighter, astronauts often held video calls with loved ones, read books, or gazed at Earth through the cupola's wide windows. Bob and Doug used some of this downtime to film messages for classrooms back on Earth. They floated weightlessly, holding up objects, showing how simple tasks like washing hands or brushing teeth worked in zero gravity. To children, these demonstrations were captivating. To the astronauts, they were a way of planting seeds, sparking curiosity in a new generation who might one day follow them into space. Then there were the spacewalks. Although Bob and Doug's mission wasn't primarily designed for extravehicular activity, opportunities arose to assist with maintenance outside the station. Preparing for a spacewalk was a ritual in itself. Hours of checks, fitting into bulky suits, and breathing pure oxygen to flush nitrogen from their bloodstreams. Stepping outside the airlock, clinging to the handrails of the ISS with nothing but the void of space beyond, was an experience almost impossible to describe. The Earth spun silently below, enormous and fragile, while the infinite black of space stretched in every direction. Every movement was slow and deliberate, every tether checked twice. The sense of vulnerability was matched only by the overwhelming majesty of the view. Even as their days were filled with work, the astronauts remained acutely aware of the symbolism of their presence. For the first time in nearly a decade, American astronauts had launched from American soil aboard an American-built spacecraft. This wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a statement of independence, a rekindling of national pride. Yet they were also part of an international crew, living and working alongside colleagues from Russia, Japan, and Europe. The ISS itself was proof that cooperation across borders was possible, even in times of political tension on Earth. In quiet moments, Bob and Doug talk about the future. They knew their mission would be remembered not just for what they accomplished, but for what it represented. They were test pilots for a new era of spaceflight, one that blurred the lines between government and private enterprise, one that might eventually extend humanity beyond Earth. They understood that their journey would inspire some, concern others, and challenge all to rethink what was possible. And still, amid all these lofty reflections, there were practical concerns. Systems had to be maintained, filters replaced, software updated. Space, after all, was not forgiving. Every squeak of a valve, every flicker on a screen demanded attention. The ISS was both a marvel and a fragile machine, one that required constant vigilance to keep its human occupants alive. As days turned to weeks and weeks into months, the mission unfolded like a slow, deliberate symphony. Each note, each experiment, each observation, each communication with Earth, built toward crescendo still to come. The world watched, the engineers monitored, the astronauts persevered, and always, in the background, the awareness grew. This was only the beginning. Weeks aboard the International Space Station blended into one another, not in monotony, but in rhythm. Life in orbit followed the clockwork of Earth's rotation, and for Bob and Doug, this meant 16 sunrises and sunsets every single day. At first, the rapid change of light and shadow was disorienting. The station would drift into the darkness of Earth's shadow, plunging everything outside the windows into pitch black. And then, only minutes later, the horizon would burst into fiery bands of orange, pink, and violet as the sun reappeared. After some time, these transitions became part of their internal calendar, a cosmic heartbeat that reminded them of the passage of time. Each sunrise brought with it another set of scheduled tasks. NASA's planners on the ground filled every hour with duties: scientific research, spacecraft maintenance, exercise routines, and occasional outreach activities. The astronauts often joked that time and space felt like being in graduate school and boot camp at the same time. Constant learning, constant testing, and constant discipline. One of the most critical aspects of their daily life was exercise. Without gravity, muscles weakened and bones lost density at alarming rates. To counter this, Bob and Doug each spent nearly 2 hours per day working out on specialized equipment. There was a treadmill strapped in with harnesses and bungee cords to simulate weight, the stationary bicycle fixed to the wall, and the most important, the ARD, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, which mimicked the effects of lifting weights on Earth. They often emerged from these sessions sweating, exhausted, and floating, but their routines were vital. Without them, long-term missions, like the ones planned for Mars, would be impossible. Beyond physical health, mental health was just as important. Astronauts dealt with isolation, confinement, and the stress of being in an environment where mistakes could be fatal. To cope, Bob and Doug relied on communication with their families. Video calls were scheduled once a week, though sometimes bandwidth limitations reduced them to short voice transmissions. Still, hearing the voices of their loved ones grounded them, reminding them why they were risking so much. They also found comfort in simple routines: writing notes, journaling, watching recorded movies, or listening to music through floating earbuds. But perhaps the greatest therapy was looking out the windows of the cupola. The wide panoramic view provided a constant reminder of the world they were protecting through science and exploration. Bob often remarked on how the Earth looked alive. Oceans shifting in colors, deserts glowing under the sun, storms forming with breathtaking clarity. Doug liked watching city lights at night, pointing out familiar places, and marveling at how human civilization carved glowing networks across the darkness. From up here, borders seemed trivial, arguments and conflicts seemed small. Back on Earth, the world was following every update. News channels covered each maneuver. Social media spread clips of the astronauts floating in their capsule, and classrooms used their mission as teaching material. The astronauts became symbols of resilience during a time when much of humanity was locked down, struggling through the global pandemic. Their journey reminded millions that progress was still possible, even in difficult times. Meanwhile, engineers at SpaceX and NASA were working tirelessly behind the scenes. Every switch the astronauts touched, every reading from Dragon systems, every tiny change in trajectory was tracked and logged. Teams ran parallel simulations on Earth, constantly asking what if. What if a valve failed? What if a solar panel glitched? What if the docking clamps didn't release? By preparing for every possible scenario, they reduced the margin of uncertainty. Still, Both agencies knew space was unpredictable. Even the most perfect plan could be disrupted by one unexpected event. Inside the ISS, Bob and Doug participated in numerous scientific experiments that stretched across disciplines. Some were biological, studying how cells, bacteria, and even plants behaved in microgravity. Others were physical, like fluid dynamics experiments that tested how liquids move without the influence of weight. Then there were Earth observation programs, where the astronauts took high-resolution photographs to track environmental changes, shrinking glaciers, expanding deserts, wildfires sending plumes of smoke into the atmosphere. Each data set became part of a larger puzzle, helping scientists understand the planet in ways only space could reveal. They also acted as test subjects themselves. Blood samples were taken regularly, muscle mass measured, sleep cycles tracked. Their bodies, floating in microgravity, were laboratories of their own. These measurements weren't just for their health. They were for the future. Every piece of data brought humanity one step closer to figuring out how to survive long-term journeys to Mars or even beyond. And yet, amid the technical rigor, there were human moments of wonder. They celebrated birthdays in orbit, sometimes sending digital greetings from loved ones to the big screen inside the station. Holidays were marked with decorations, tiny flags, and even special meals stored for the occasion. Laughter floated through the modules when crew members played pranks, hiding small objects floating upside down during calls, or surprising each other with new ways to maneuver in zero gravity. Even in one of the harshest environments imaginable, humanity found a way to create joy. Spacewalk preparations, too, offered drama and excitement. Even if Bob and Doug weren't scheduled for frequent ones, they trained alongside other crew members for potential emergencies. Each time the airlock cycled, each time a suited figure stepped into the void, everyone felt the tension. A spacewalk wasn't just work. It was a reminder how thin the line between life and death could be in orbit. One tear in a suit, one failed tether, and everything could be lost. The astronauts were trained to handle it, but they were never blind to the risk. As the weeks passed, the mission began to draw comparisons to history's great explorations. Commentators on Earth likened Bob and Doug to the sailors of the Age of Discovery, charting routes through uncharted seas. Just as caravels had once sailed to unknown continents, their capsule dragon represented a vessel into the unknown. Though this time, the oceans were not of water, but of stars. The symbolism was powerful, and many believed this mission marked the dawn of a new era in human expansion. And yet, for the astronauts themselves, the day-to-day reality was less about grand speeches and more about the details. Tightening a bolt, logging a temperature reading, calibrating a sensor. It was in these small, precise actions that their mission's success was built. They knew history would remember the launch and the landing, but they also knew that the true measure of success was hidden in the countless hours of invisible work that kept them alive and moving forward. Still, always hovering in the back of their minds was the knowledge that their stay would not last forever. Dragon awaited, dormant but vigilant, ready to carry them back to Earth when the time came. Its sleek design floated like a sentinel attached to the station, its systems quietly whispering data back to mission control. The spacecraft was both a promise and a challenge. It promised safety, but it also challenged them to trust technology in one of the most dangerous return maneuvers ever designed. And so, the mission continued, day by day, orbit by orbit, discovery by discovery. The world below turned endlessly, unaware at times of the tiny capsule circling above, carrying two men who represented both the fragility and the audacity of human ambition. The silence of the cosmos was never truly silent. It carried with it a faint hum, a vibration that even the most advanced instruments could barely register. Scientists called it cosmic background radiation, a whisper left over from the birth of everything. But beyond the equations and technical language, it was more than a sound. It was a memory, the memory of creation itself. For civilizations scattered across galaxies, that hum was the only constant. Stars were born, stars died, empires rose and fell, planets thrived and then crumbled into dust, but a background hum remained, like a reminder that the universe itself was alive. And somewhere between the dark voids and the spiraling arms of galaxies, humanity was just beginning to understand how small it really was. In the 22nd century, explorers aboard the Vigilant Horizon had been tasked with a mission no one dared to call routine. They weren't chasing resources or colonies or even knowledge in conventional sense. They were chasing an anomaly. Deep space telescopes had detected something unnatural, a signal repeating every 88 seconds, too structured to be random, too ancient to be artificial in the human sense. It pulsed like a heartbeat, radiating from a region long thought to be empty. That place was cataloged as Sector 9-0, a void between galaxies, a place where gravity wells collided and where light itself seemed reluctant to travel. No civilization had dared to chart it. Until now, as the Vigilant Horizon cut through the abyss, the crew grew restless. The stars, once familiar companions, grew thin. The windows showed less and less. Fewer stars, more darkness. It was as though they were approaching the edge of existence itself. Dr. Alara Vey, the ship's chief astrophysicist, documented her thoughts. Space isn't supposed to feel hostile, not in the way airless deserts or frozen tundras do. It's indifferent. But here, in this region, the void isn't indifferent. It's watching. Her words were not a scientific report. They were an instinct, the kind that could not be measured on screens or analyzed with formulas. When the ship's sensors finally locked onto the source of the anomaly, what they found was beyond comprehension. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a planet. It was architecture, a structure the size of a moon, floating in the void, carved of material older than any known element. Its surface shifted like liquid metal, yet remained solid, as if it existed in more than one state at once. Patterns flowed across its exterior, geometric fractals that resembled constellations, only distorted, like maps of skies that had never belonged to this universe. The hum they had detected was no longer faint. It shook the hull of the ship, vibrating inside their bones. Some of the crew called it music. Others said it was a warning. And then came the strangest discovery of all. The structure wasn't emitting the hum. It was amplifying it. The sound, the pulse, was not local. It was coming from beyond the observable universe. And this construct was nothing more than a relay, a translator left adrift in the dark. The crew of the Vigilant Horizon debated for hours, but no argument could smother the pull of curiosity. Mankind had crossed light years not to turn away at the edge of the unknown. So they approached. Docking ports, doors, or windows did not exist on the alien construct. And yet, as they drew near, the surface of the moon-sized structure began to shift. Matter folded away like ripples in water, revealing an entrance too perfectly aligned with their trajectory to be coincidence. The structure had been waiting for them. Inside, corridors stretched into infinity, their walls alive with shifting patterns of light. The crew's sensors went haywire. Distances couldn't be measured, air pressure refused to stabilize, and even time itself seemed uncertain. Their footsteps echoed in ways that did not match the rhythm of their movement, as though something else was walking alongside them, just out of sight. And then, in the heart of the structure, they found it, a chamber vast enough to hold entire cities, yet perfectly silent. At its center floated a crystalline sphere. Pulsing in rhythm with the hum, they had tracked across galaxies. Dr. Alara Vey approached, her voice trembling. This isn't just a machine, it's memory, a record of a civilization far older than ours. Maybe older than the universe we know. She was right. The sphere contained imprints, data, visions, echoes of the people who had lived before stars were born, their downfall, their warnings, and perhaps their hope for whoever would come after. The hum wasn't random. It was a message, a reminder etched into the fabric of reality. All civilizations fall, but knowledge must endure. The crew returned to their ship changed. They had not uncovered treasure, nor a new world to colonize, but something far greater. Proof that humanity was not the first to walk this path, and likely would not be the last. As the Vigilant Horizon left the void, the structure sealed itself again, fading into the silence of eternity. The hum continued, echoing across galaxies, waiting for the next explorers brave enough to listen. Studio microphone narrator's closing words. In the end, space is not empty. It is filled with the stories of those who came before us, some written in light, some whispered in sound, and some hidden in structures that defy time itself. Humanity has only just begun its journey, But the universe has been keeping its secrets for eons. If you were standing on the Vigilant Horizon, facing that ancient structure, would you step inside or turn away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of the cosmos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the unknown.